He was going up. And there was no one that could feasibly stop him this time. He was the commander now, after all, and a knight to boot. If he wanted to fly, he would. Even if the orders from command were to cease operations. A few of his officer friends were tagging along, entirely on their own accord. They wanted to see Tarnopol, the city that had been on the horizon for years now, always getting closer, but never truly in reach. Soon enough the news would reach the rest of the squadron, and there'd be no escaping his fate. He'd be shoved into a staff car, and there was no telling if he'd ever see the inside of a cockpit again. Contact. The war may have turned his dream of flight into a nightmare, but a nightmare was still a dream, damn it. Once aloft, Vikram breathed deeply from the frigid air. It still tasted the same. It had the taste of freedom, and of a shedding of his earthly woes. He'd miss it. Boy, would he miss it. Despite everything, he loved flying. He glanced over his shoulder to check on the rest of his flight, but saw no one. They had vanished? No? Wait. There they were, quite a ways off to the east. Vikram frowned, causing his goggles to shift uncomfortably against the bridge of his nose. They were awfully high. How could they have climbed so quickly? He had a strange feeling in his gut as he watched the two planes go round and round above the aerodrome. The same kind of sinking feeling he'd get when flying into heavy flak. Something was wrong. Mere minutes in the air on his last flight, and something was wrong. He strained his eyes, banged slightly to shield his eyes from the sun. Had his wingman seen something? There shouldn't be anything about. Last he had heard, all Russian air assets had been withdrawn. Then, suddenly, he saw it. Bright yellow tracer rounds arcing down towards the ground. He followed them back towards the sky, and the sinking feeling became a hard knot of surprise and fear. Those were not Austrian machines. And furthermore, they weren't just a handful. A large group of enemy aircraft crowded in toward the airfield. One, two, three, four diving down, strafing the men on the ground he'd left just a moment ago. Five, six. He saw two planes he suspected to be his wingmen go hard for a bomber, but hostile scouts were bearing down upon them in turn. Seven, 8, 9, 10. Yet none had paid any attention to Vikram yet. He had to make a decision. Rolling his plane steeply over, he saw a lone bomber and a crowded furball, perhaps 700 meters below. Dropping to their altitude would mean a 3 versus 1. He would be too late to save the others. Christ! Moments ago he'd shaken their hands. Ever take the Russians. Someone was down. Another Austrian plane seemed to be going down in flames. Indecision. Yet he couldn't bring himself to dive. Perhaps it was cowardice. Perhaps it was instinct. Either way, it saved him, for just then the sound of engines brought him back to the moment, and he pulled sharply on the stick, revealing another throng of Nieuports just beside him. This was his fight then, Vikram thought. And for a while he lost track of time as he hurled himself and his machine once more into the breach. There seemed to be machines everywhere. Bullets. There! No, a friendly bird. Next man, rake him across the stern. The trick was, Vikram thought, to injure as many as possible. Conserve ammunition, but bring them out of the fight. bat swerved into his sights, and he squeezed the trigger. Marveled as it seemed to come apart on its own accord. He dashed through the falling debris and spotted 2 more enemies ahead. One was firing his guns on the remaining Austrian. Vikram kept switching targets as often as he dared to, firing short bursts into them and moving on, praying he could avoid picking up a tail. He jerked his plane to the side as his prey lost a wing and spun, up and about, almost colliding with him as it spiraled out of control and broke apart. He'd forgotten how many rounds he'd fired, and he hadn't the time to check. Rounds slammed into the side of his machine, passing out the other side, just behind his seat. Vikram pushed the throttle, pulling away for some breathing room. The fuel. The rounds must have pierced the tank, but the leak was minor. And then, suddenly, he was alone. He could see a few dots, already distant, and marveled again at how suddenly a furball could go from utter chaos to silence in the space of a heartbeat. Are they all gone? No, one lone Newport coming out of the sun. This one didn't worry Vikram. It was just a matter of time and ammunition, though in truth he had little of either. They danced for a while, swinging back and forth like a pendulum. But the outcome was predetermined. And soon he was alone again. Vikram took a moment to compose himself. How could they have possibly mustered so many planes? The truce was all but complete. So was the success of their surprise attack, he thought begrudgingly. His wingman would have been caught taking off. He himself had escaped by sheer luck, having elected for an uncharacteristically prudent takeoff, more into the wind that separated him from the others. He wasn't going to see Chernopol again, but he'd settle for another sunrise. He turned back north, keeping his eyes open for the airfield or for enemies. A dozen minutes later, he saw the former, flanked by observation balloons that had failed in their duty. The dogfight was now long over with, it appeared. Vikram felt strangely disappointed, frustrated to be denied a chance to avenge his friends, men who'd survived the war, served with distinction, men he had asked to do one more flight. For a damn fancy. A vain desire to overfly the city as a conqueror. They eagerly agreed. He'd been laughing over the morning coffee. He'd promised them a round of drinks. Around and round and round the plane had gone, falling, burning out of the sky. And not over enemy lands, but right next to where he'd woken up that morning. Vikram could feel tears on his cheek, against the leather of his goggles, uncomfortable. What a damned waste. The whole war, a damned waste. The wheels touched the ground. The field was emptied of airframes. He was the only one who made it back. But just like all those friends, rivals, enemies who'd fallen over the years, to machine guns, to artillery, to engine failure and damn bad luck, Rich men, poor men, brave men and cowards, heroes and villains, all in every shade of miserable, muddy brown in between. He shared one thing. Though he was alive, after 3 years of war, and they were not, they had one thing in common. Vikram Spearglass would never fly again. The engine sputtered, coughed once, twice. The propeller slowed, then stopped. Vikram loosened his harness and leaned forward to grab and close the radiator lever. He leaned back, quiet. Slowly, almost languidly, the fingers of his left hand flipped the magneto switch. There was movement around his plane. Cheers and shouting, papers being passed around. Vikram Spearglass shut the fuel valve. A mechanic was leading his friends in a merry dance around the gramophone by the hangar doors. That was it, then. With ritualistic precision, he tapped each gauge in the cockpit, making sure the dials rested right behind the glass. Resting. After so long. He leaned back again, the familiar discomfort of the Albatross cockpit reassuring. He remembered the cockpit of the Fokker Eindecker, the Halberstadt, the Pfalz trainers, the Siemens Schuckert. But he couldn't quite remember the man who'd flown them, way back in 1915 and 16. The new year was just around the corner. 1918 loomed, mere days away, and the guns were still firing. Men were still dying all these years later. He'd changed nothing for the better anyway. They'd fought and they'd killed and died for their country. And the country was smaller, poorer, starving, even in victory. Germany was much the same, he had no doubt, and England and France. He had no idea what America was like. They'd had the right idea, though, joined the winning side at the very end. He laughed again, and finally climbed out of the cockpit. His boots crunched on the frozen ground. The festivities paused for a moment, as dozens of heads, smiles on their dirty faces, turned on Vikram. Commandant Spearglass. He gave a salute. He gave them the speech they expected, and he meant most of it. You have in truth done your duty. Everything your country can ask of you, you have done. And though he smiled through their cheers, and shook the hands of fresh-faced youngsters and weathered veterans alike, there was a distance between them, growing with every second now that the Albatross engine was cooling slowly in the snow. Most of these men would go west, to the Italian front. Many of these men, now flush with joy and victory against the Russians, would soon die fighting against another foe. The war wasn't over. Their war wasn't over. But his was.